Surgeon's hands were shaking so badly he knocked the instrument tray sideways. Forceps hit the floor. The scrub nurse reached for the crash cart. And in Operating Room 4 at Mercy General Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia, a man's open chest sat under the lights with no one qualified to close it. That was the moment everyone in that room turned and looked at the janitor standing in the doorway. Not a resident, not a fellow, not even a nurse. The janitor. His name was Calvin Okafor. He was 31 years old. He had mop water on his shoes and a hospital-issued lanyard around his neck that said Environmental Services in block letters. He had a face that people forgot the moment they looked away from it. Average height, quiet eyes, the kind of man airport security waves through because he seems like nobody worth stopping. He was standing in that doorway because he had heard the alarms. He had been mopping the corridor outside OR4 for the third time that night because the floor never really got clean. Someone always tracked something back in, and then the monitor started screaming and the door swung open, and doctor started screaming and the door swung open, and Dr. Raymond Holt stumbled out holding his own chest, and Calvin Okafor caught him before he hit the floor. That was 4 minutes ago. Now Dr. Holt was on a gurney being rushed toward the cardiac unit, and the patient on the table inside, a man named Arthur Briggs, 62 years old, retired schoolteacher, 3 grandchildren, had an exposed coronary bypass graft that nobody in that room knew how to finish closing. The chief resident, Dr. Simone Adler, was pressing her gloved hands flat on the instrument tray and trying to breathe. She had 2 years of residency. She had never led a bypass alone. She had her phone out and was trying to reach another attending, and the on-call cardiologist was 40 minutes away because it was 11:17 on a Tuesday night in January, and half the surgical staff was down with a flu that had swept through the hospital the week before. Calvin stood in the doorway. He did not move. He did not speak. He watched the monitors. He watched the angle of the retractors. He watched Dr. Adler's hands, the way they hovered just above the sternum without landing, the way her fingers knew they should be doing something but couldn't decide what. He had seen this before. Not in a hospital. Not as a doctor. But in a way that most people in that room would have laughed at if he had tried to explain it. Calvin Okafor had grown up watching surgery. His mother, Vivian Okafor, had worked housekeeping at Grady Memorial for 22 years. She brought him in after school when childcare fell through, which was often. She parked him in the break room with a sandwich and told him not to touch anything, and Calvin, who had nothing else to do, watched the monitors in the hallway, watched the orderlies, watched the nurses, watched, through the small rectangular windows and operating room doors, every procedure he could find an angle on. He was 12 when he first understood what a retractor was. He was 14 when he could identify the phases of a coronary bypass by the sequence of instrument requests coming from behind closed doors. He was 16 when a retired cardiothoracic surgeon named Dr. Tayo Thoracic Surgeon Everett Nash started eating lunch in the break room 3 times a week because his wife was recovering from hip surgery on the 4th floor, and he had nowhere else to go, and he found the boy in the corner reading a copy of Gray's Anatomy that someone had left behind. Dr. Nash talked. Calvin listened. That went on for 4 months. Then Dr. Nash's wife went home, and he stopped coming, but not before he had given Calvin 3 textbooks, a worn copy of Sebastian's Surgical Atlas with margin notes in blue ink, and the quiet, measured opinion that the boy understood cardiac anatomy better than half the medical students he had taught in 30 years at Emory. None of that showed on the lanyard around Calvin's neck. He had applied to medical school twice. The first time his MCAT score wasn't high enough. He had taken it without a prep course because he couldn't afford one, studying at the kitchen table after 12-hour shifts. The second time, his score was strong enough, but his application essays flagged an academic dismissal from his first semester of college, a semester during which his mother had a stroke and he had missed too many classes sitting at her bedside, and 3 programs waitlisted him and then declined. And one interviewer told him, with genuine kindness, that his path had been non-traditional in ways that present challenges for committee assessment. He had mopped floors since then. He did not stop reading. The books lived in a milk crate under his bed. He bought used copies of the latest surgical journals from a resale site that sold returns from university libraries. He took free online lectures from Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic and watched them on his phone during his lunch break, sitting in his car in the hospital parking deck in the dark. Nobody knew. His coworkers liked him. His supervisor thought he was reliable. His neighbors knew him as the quiet man in apartment 2C who played no music after 9 and always held the elevator. Not one person in his life, outside of a dead-end trail of rejection letters, knew what Calvin Okafor knew. And now he was standing in the doorway of OR4, and a man was dying on the table, and nobody in that room could finish what Dr. Holt had started. Dr. Adler looked up. She looked at him the way people look at the wrong door, not expecting anything useful behind it. "Sir, you need to leave this area," she said. Her voice was controlled. She was trying. Calvin did not leave. "The proximal anastomosis on the left anterior descending," he said. "It's not fully seated. You can see the tension on the suture line from here. If you don't address that before you close the pericardium, you're going to have a bleed they won't catch until he codes in recovery." Silence. Not the silence of agreement. The silence of a room where everyone has heard something they can't immediately process. "Excuse me," Dr. Adler said. "I'm not trying to override you," Calvin said. "I'm telling you what I can see from where I'm standing. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am." The scrub nurse, a woman named Paulette, who had been in that OR for 19 years, looked at the monitor, looked at the field, looked at Calvin. "He's right," she said quietly. "I was watching that line. I didn't want to say." Dr. Adler's jaw tightened. She was 29 years old, and she had worked for everything she had, and she did not need a man in a green cleaning uniform telling her what to do in her operating room. "Who are you?" she said. "I'm the janitor," Calvin said, "and I'm sorry, but you need to address that suture line." The monitor, alarmed. Arthur Briggs's pressure dropped 4 points. Dr. Adler made a decision, not because she trusted him, because she was out of options, and the man on the table was running out of time. "Tell me exactly what you see," she said. Calvin stepped forward. He did not touch anything. He stood at the edge of the sterile field and he talked, and Dr. Adler listened, and Paulette handed her instruments, and for the next 22 minutes, something happened in OR4 at Mercy General that no one in that room would describe the same way afterward. Calvin described the tension on the suture line. He described the angle of correction. He described, from memory, the technique he had read in a paper published in the Journal of Thoracic and Cardiovascular Surgery 14 months earlier, a paper about anastomotic revision under suboptimal conditions, a paper that Dr. Chista Adler had not read because she had been on a 72-hour rotation the week it came out. He did not touch the patient. He did not claim to be anything he was not. He stood at the edge of the room and he talked to Doctor through a procedure that needed to happen. And she did it. And her hands stopped shaking somewhere around minute 9. And by minute 22, the suture line was corrected and Arthur Briggs's pressure was climbing back toward stable. When it was over, Dr. Adler stepped back from the table. She was breathing hard. She looked at the monitors for a long time before she looked at Calvin. "Who taught you that?" she said. "A retired surgeon named Nash," Calvin said, "and about 15 years of reading everything I could find." She looked at his lanyard, Environmental Services. "You applied to med school," she said. It was not a question. "Twice," he said. She didn't say anything else right then. She turned back to the patient and helped Paulette begin the closing. Calvin picked up the forceps that had fallen on the floor at the start of all this, dropped them in the sharps bin, and went back to his mop in the hallway. He finished the floor. He clocked out at 1:45 in the morning. He drove home in his 2009 Honda Civic with a crack in the dashboard and a heater that only worked on the left side, and he ate a bowl of cereal standing over his kitchen sink, and he did not tell anyone what had happened. He did not think in that moment that anything would change. He was wrong. Dr. Adler filed an incident report the next morning, not against Calvin, for him. She wrote 4 pages, which was unusual for an incident report, and she CC'd the chief of surgery, Dr. Eben, Lawrence Beaumont, and the hospital's director of medical education, and she attached a copy of the surgical atlas technique Calvin had described with the citation, because she had looked it up that morning and confirmed what she had suspected. He had been right. Not approximately right. Precisely right. Dr. Beaumont called Calvin into his office 3 days later. Calvin showed up in his uniform because he had been in the middle of a shift and no one told him to change, and he sat in a chair across from the chief of surgery with mop water on his shoes for the second time in a week. In doctor's surgery, Beaumont looked at him for a long moment and then asked him to explain himself. Calvin explained himself. He talked for 40 minutes. Dr. Beaumont did not interrupt. He asked 2 questions. At the end, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and let out a slow breath. "You know what I find remarkable," Dr. Beaumont said, "is not that you knew what to do, it's that you waited for her to ask." "It wasn't my room," Calvin said. "No," Dr. Beaumont said, "it wasn't." He was quiet for a moment. "It could be." The hospital did not give Calvin a medical degree. That is not how any of this works. What happened was slower and more bureaucratic and more real than that. Dr. Beaumont made 3 calls. One to a former colleague, now on the admissions board at Morehouse School of Medicine. One to the director of a post-baccalaureate program designed for non-traditional applicants. One to the hospital's legal department to understand what could and could not be offered to a current employee without conflict. What was offered 2 months later was a scholarship, full funding, plus a stipend that would allow Calvin to stop mopping floors and start studying full-time. There was a condition. Calvin had to actually get in. The scholarship would hold a spot, but he had to apply and be accepted on his own merits. He applied. He wrote the essay about his mother's stroke, and about the break room at Grady, and about Dr. Nash in the margin notes in blue ink, and about what it felt like to watch patients move through a hospital system from the other side of the glass, from the hallway, with a mop, knowing things that nobody thought to ask him. He wrote about OR4. He wrote about Arthur Briggs's suture line. He wrote about the fact that he had not said a word until Dr. Bellis. Adler was out of options, because it was her room and her patient and her call. And the most important thing he had learned from 15 years of reading surgical literature was that confidence without invitation was just arrogance in a different uniform. The admissions committee read his file in February. In March, he received an acceptance letter. He read it sitting in his car in the parking deck of Mercy General on his lunch break, the same parking deck where he had watched surgical lectures on his phone for years. He read it twice. Then he sat there for a while and didn't do anything, because some moments require time before they become real. He called his mother, Vivian Okafor, who had mopped floors so her son could sit in a break room with a sandwich and a book, listen to him read the letter aloud. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. "I knew," she said. "I always knew." Arthur Briggs was discharged from Mercy General 9 days after his surgery. He walked out of the hospital on his own 2 feet with his daughter on his left side and a discharge packet in his right hand. He did not know at that point what had happened in OR4 while he was unconscious. He knew only that his surgery had gone well and that the nursing staff had been kind. He found out later. Dr. Adler told him because she felt he deserved to know. She told him there had been a complication and that it had been caught, and that the man who had caught it was a hospital employee named Calvin Okafor, and that he had just been accepted to medical school. Arthur Briggs asked for Calvin's address. He sent a letter, handwritten, 3 pages. He was a retired school teacher and he knew how to write, and he used that. He talked about his grandchildren. He talked about his guardian. He talked about his garden, which he had been afraid he would never see again. He talked about what it meant, at 62, to understand that your life had been in the hands of someone the world had spent 30 years underestimating. He ended the letter with 1 line. "The world is going to be better for having you in that operating room. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Calvin kept the letter in the same milk crate as the textbooks. He read it sometimes when the studying got hard, which was often, because medical school is hard for everyone, and Calvin was doing it without the built-in networks and prep courses and family connections that smoothed the path for others. He kept going. He graduated from Morehouse School of Medicine 4 years later, on a Saturday in May, with his mother in the front row in a yellow dress she had bought 3 months early and hung on the back of her bedroom door so she could see it every morning. Dr. Adler was there too. She had kept in touch. She was an attending now, a real one, and she stood in the back of the auditorium because she hadn't wanted to make a thing of it, but she wanted to be there. Dr. Nash was not there. He had passed away the year before, quietly, at home in his 80s. Calvin had found out through an obituary. He had sat with that for a while. When Calvin Okafor's name was called and he walked across the stage and received his degree, the applause in that room was the same as it was for everyone else. No fanfare, no announcement of what it had taken, just a man's name, a handshake, a rolled diploma. That was enough. He matched into a cardiothoracic surgery residency program in Atlanta. He is there now. He still drives the 2009 Civic. He fixed the heater. In the residence lounge at the hospital, there is a whiteboard where people write things, schedules, jokes, complaints about the coffee machine. Someone wrote a question on it 6 months ago, and nobody has erased it because nobody can quite bring themselves to. It says, "Who in this hospital is smarter than you think?" Nobody knows who wrote it. Some people think it was Calvin. He has never said. There's an image I keep coming back to. Calvin Okafor, standing in the hallway of a hospital, mop in hand, watching surgical procedures through a small rectangular window in a door, not asking to be let in, not announcing what he knew, just watching, learning, carrying it quietly for 15 years. Most of us would have quit, not because we're weak, but because the world has a way of telling you, over and over, in forms and rejection letters and sidelong glances, that you don't belong in the room. Most people eventually believe it. Calvin didn't. And I think about why that is. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a miracle. It was something simpler and harder than either of those things. It was the decision, made again and again across 15 years of night shifts and parking decks and used textbooks, to keep going anyway. That kind of persistence isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like a man mopping the same floor for the 3rd time because it never quite gets clean. But underneath it, something is being built, slowly, without applause, without anyone watching. What Calvin understood, that I think a lot of us forget, is that ability doesn't wait for permission to exist. He didn't become knowledgeable the night he walked into OR4. He already was. The room just finally caught up to what was already there. And then there's the part of this story that I find the most honest. When he stepped forward, he didn't push Dr. Adler aside. He didn't say, "Let me do this." He stood at the edge of the sterile field, and he talked, and he waited for her to lead, because it was her room and her patient. That restraint, knowing what you know, and still choosing to support rather than overtake, that's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of character to build. Anyone can be right and loud about it. It takes something else entirely to be right and still make space for someone else's authority. That's what I took from Calvin's story. Not just that he was brilliant, but that he was decent about it. He could have let his resentment curdle into something ugly after 2 rejection letters and years of being invisible. He didn't. He kept the knowledge, kept the discipline, kept the basic human decency of knowing that his moment to matter would come, and that when it did, he would handle it without making someone else small in the process. The cause and effect here isn't mysterious. Calvin invested in his mind for 15 years with no guarantee of return. When the moment came, he had exactly what was needed. Arthur Briggs went home to his garden. Dr. Adler became a better doctor for having been in that room. And Calvin got his letter. None of that happens without all 3 things working together. The knowledge he refused to stop building, the character he refused to compromise, and the will to keep showing up to a world that kept telling him not to bother. I think about the whiteboard in that residence lounge. Who in this hospital is smarter than you think? The answer, more often than we're comfortable admitting, is the person we stopped looking at a long time ago.